morning. My name is John Mancini, and welcome to the second season, second show in our records modernization workshops. Today, we're going to spend some time talking about the new NARA digitization guidelines and the slant we want to give it. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. There's an awful lot of information out there right now, and NARA has done a really terrific job of teeing up some additional information to help people understand the implications of the new guidelines. But we want to think about some of the maybe issues under the covers that you ought to be thinking about, particularly from an end user perspective of somebody who's either running a records management program or running a scanning imaging program, and maybe some questions you ought to be asking as you think through what you do with this and how you do it and where you go from here. So welcome to the session. A couple of logistic questions just before we get started here. We've started to roll out some of the new Zoom capabilities in this workshop. And so like any new software, and Zoom struggles a little bit with some of the newer things. If some things look a little bit less familiar than they once did, that's because Zoom is rolling out new features. A couple things, people usually ask for a copy of the presentation. There is a copy of the presentation available under the resources tab that you will see. A link to a recording of this presentation will be sent immediately afterwards. Questions that people have are now viewable to the attendees, and I would urge you to take a look at those during the course of the webinar and see questions that folks might ask questions. You know, we'll be happy to answer as many as we can. If we don't know the answer to them, we probably will be able to answer them on the next session, which will be on December 15th with Michael Horsley from NARA, who's one of the godfathers of all this. So please feel free to ask questions. Also, if you see a question that you know the answer to, chime in, and you're able to chat on that and answer those questions right within the question and answer functionality. We have not turned on yet the attendee chatting and the live audio questions component. So we still want to make sure how all that works and that we understand exactly how to make that most effective. So if you see the little raise your hand thing, I can't call on you. So your best bet is always to just raise the hand. Raise the hand. I just saw one. So your best bet is to always ask it as a Q&A in the Q&A thing, and keep an eye on that, and we'll see what's going on. A lot of folks often ask about previous sessions that we've done. All of the recordings that we've done for both session 1 and session 2 are available at this YouTube link. This YouTube link is also in the presentation. So if you download the presentation, you can kind of get to it pretty easy. The other way is that if you go to YouTube and just search on Quality Associates, you'll find those links pretty easily. So without further ado, we have here today Scott Swidersky from Quality Associates. Those of you that don't know me, I'm the former president for many years of AIM. I'm also the author of a book that makes a great Christmas present called Immigrant Secrets, available on Amazon.com. And so by way of introduction, let me just switch gears and ask Scott to talk a little bit about the new QAI website and use that as an introduction both to him and to QAI.
Thanks, John. So yeah, as John said, Scott Swidersky, I work for Konica Minolta, but under the brand of Quality Associates, so not to be too confusing. One of the things that we sat down and have thought quite a bit about is how do we make all the work that we're doing in our Digital Innovation Center today available to our customers that are looking for answers or maybe just looking for techniques or better guidance beyond just what we're publishing in white papers and so forth. So we undertook a redevelopment of our website recently. If you go out to Quality Associates Inc., you'll see a section there that's referred to as the Records Modernization Solutions. It'll be a work in progress for us for quite some time, but the idea is to try and take what comes to us on a daily basis in terms of questions around, quality management systems, the producing of FADGI, how it is that we operationalize all of this in production environments. So really just trying to take the most popular and the less frequently asked questions and try to get answers back to our audience through the website. So we're attempting to do this through video, blogs, white papers, creating an archive of all of our on-demand webinars and so forth. So it's not all there today, but that's our goal. So if you get a moment and have a chance to get out there, feel free to give us some feedback too on the content that you see out there. We're going to continue to publish as much as we possibly can, but that's really the goal behind the rebuild of the site, is to create this significant resource center around all these questions that continue to come into us.
Great. Thanks, Scott. And the site looks great, by the way. I don't know who did it, but it looks really terrific. You guys did a very nice job with that.
Thanks.
What we're going to be talking about today, let me start by talking about what we're not going to be talking about today, because one of the issues that we've found when we talk to people as they bump up against these new digitization standards is they tend to think that it is all encompassing and covers everything that's out there. And what's going on right now is that there's an awful lot that we're not talking about today, and some things that haven't changed. And it's useful to kind of keep an eye on that and think about that, because it represents a framework and a context to think about the new standards and what you need to do in order to meet them. The definition of a permanent record has not changed. Regulations for formatting permanent digital records have not changed. Regulations for transferring permanent digital records haven't changed. For digitizing temporary records haven't changed. There's also, probably more than three, but three basic buckets of records. There's presidential records, congressional records, and federal records. And this doesn't cover presidential records and congressional records. And so all these links are live in the presentation. So if you have any questions about what all this is about, you can really find out a whole lot of detail directly on the NARA site. Scott, tell us what we are talking about today.
Sounds good. So we're going to focus, I think it's known to most of the audience that's on this webinar that NARA previously amended, 36 CFR Part 1236 to add standards for the digitization of temporary records, which constitute the majority of all the federal records that we work in. What we're going to focus on is this outstanding document that this bit of guidance that NARA has recently published called the Digitization Quality Management Guide. And there's a number of things in there that are extremely well explained, and they focus around the considerations of key areas like quality assurance, quality control, inspection requirements, validation requirements. These are all things that NARA has put considerable thought into and released this recent guidance document to help people that are doing digitization today to really kind of better understand what these more modern techniques and what the impact of their process might be. So that's really going to be, John, the focus of what we're after today.
So, there's kind of an infinite number of things that we could talk about in the context of these new regs. This is what the subpart E looks like. These are all the different factors that are in there. And we chose today that, because it's one of the areas that we get the most questions about is the quality management requirements, and spend a little time on that. So as you kind of think about that, also, this is what the quality management guide from NARA looks like. I don't know who wrote it. I want to find out who they did, because they did an outstanding job on this document. It's really very terrific and comprehensive, and well done, NARA, kind of in the process of putting that together. But we're going to be talking about the quality management requirements. And more specifically, we're going to talk about 4 elements that are in there. So what you'll find as we kind of get into this is that we're going to deal with each one of these in turn. There's an element in there under this 1236 right there, 1236.46, that talks about quality assurance. There's an element that talks about quality control. There's an element that talks about what you need to do to inspect documents once they've been scanned. And there's an element that talks about how you validate the processes that you've used for scanning and capture in your organization. So those are the four things we're going to try to dive into today. And the main reason for that is that, we found that an awful lot of people have started to become aware of what the basic rules and regs are, but they are still struggling with the question of operationalizing them. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time going through what's in the quality management guide, going through what's in the regulations, because there are ways to get that. And we'd be happy to answer any questions about that offline. But what we really want to do is get you thinking about what some of the implications are and some of the operational questions that you need to think through. So as we do this, what you'll find, there's going to be 4 slides, and there is a lot on these slides. And again, what we're trying to do is pique your interest in terms of thinking about some of the issues that you ought to be thinking about as you wrestle with this. On these slides, the top line, this is what's from the quality management guide that NARA put out. And I'll cover just very quickly what each one, talk a little bit about what each one of these things is. And then I'm going to turn it over to Scott in each case and have Scott spend a little bit of time just reflecting a bit on some of the operational consequences of how you go about making these things become real. And again, we've got the question tab open, so please feel free to ask any questions about anything that we talk through along the way. And then also, if you're following the question thing, if you know the answer to a question that somebody posts, then please don't hesitate to chime in and help out. So in terms of the elements of a quality assurance plan, and this is basically, if you want to think about, okay, how do I start the strategy of thinking about how I implement all of this? This is sort of like take a step back before you kind of get rolling and think about, like, what am I going to do? How do I set up a strategy? And so the 4 elements that NARA talks about that you need to do is you need to understand the equipment that you have in-house to meet the requirements. So the way that you have to do that is by scanning a reference target to see whether the equipment is capable of producing FADGI-3 quality images. Second thing is that you need to look at all of the systems that you have for determining image quality performance and how you might go about meeting that. You need to then look at how that equipment and how those systems perform in the context of some trial digitization efforts. And then you need to verify that all of the images are consistent with the NARA requirements. So as you think about this, some of the things that you ought to really be reflecting a bit on, let me ask Scott to talk a little bit about some of these items.
Thanks, John. So the best way that I thought I'd go about just highlighting a few of these key areas. One of the questions, first of all, that comes back to us is what I have in place today sufficient for what I need to do moving forward? And the answer is no. There's a lot of considerations that need to be taken into this digitization process, whether it's a part of an overall quality management program, how it relates to QA, QC, inspections, and ultimately validation around metadata. So I want to read a just quick snippet from this quality management guide, because I don't think we could have said it or prepared it any better. So I'll start with that, and then I'll go back, John, and give us a few examples of things that are important. This is again from the Digitization Quality Management Guide. So it says, the quality assurance component of a quality management program includes the mandatory requirements, specifications, and standards that a digitization project must meet. The major components of a digitization product are quality, metadata quality, records management quality, and file format compliance. The goal or I should say, the aim of a quality assurance program is consistency and accuracy. The goal of a QA program is to prevent deviations by performing systemic checks and analysis throughout the production cycle and implementing corrective actions. So if we think about the impact of what it is that I just shared, most of our QA programs and processes today are not that controlled. The data that for most of us that we use for either archival purposes or we're using for purposes of sharing content, we're not having to relate to these guidelines around end-to-end both consistency and therefore accuracy. Now, in some of our projects where we go through our rendering process of attempting to extract text and so forth for metadata purposes, that may be the case. But if we're doing the digitization process purely for archival purposes, there's a good chance that our quality assurance plan today in the agency is not following these very, very strict type of guidelines that are going to be necessary to comply with NARA downstream. So a couple things. A lot of the imaging, and I'm focused now on the first column, talking about the hardware and the devices itself. A lot of things that we see today are either centralized or decentralized. And in a lot of these decentralized conversion environments, we're finding that devices like multifunctional devices are acting as the actual scanning equipment. These devices today are not being put under the testing process that's needed to comply with these FADGI 3-star requirements. There are a number of devices that are out there from a number of different manufacturers. Many of those organizations we've invited into our Digital Innovation Center to test what the parameters of these devices can and can't do. Some of these devices can move from a mode of producing FADGI 3-star output and convert back to producing non-FADGI 3-star output. So there's a bit that needs to be done to try to determine, at least initially, what this equipment is going to be in order to comply with these requirements. Secondly, in the second column, developing a test plan, right? And then ultimately analyzing the results. What needs to go into place to determine whether or not this content that I'm creating is in fact complying with these requirements? So a lot of this is not in place today, and it would obviously need to be something that's considered as a modification to the overall quality assurance plan. I'm in the third column with monitoring equipment performance. Some of these devices we're finding are not running at rated speeds because of the need to, comply with the FADGI 3-star compliance. This all needs to be taken into consideration. The stop and starts around the testing process for calibrating devices and so forth is another area that we would monitor to take into consideration around overall performance. And then lastly, verifying the resulting digital files. How is that done, right? Is that something that NARA does? Is that something that my agency is spot checking or doing in its entirety, prior to making this upload or submission to NARA? Again, an additional step that would fall, well within the means of a quality assurance plan, but traditionally not something that's being done by federal agencies today.
That's extremely helpful, Scott. And I think it highlights the fact that I remember Lisa Haralampus a long time ago when they were first talking about these new regulations and standards said, had a quote, something to the effect of, standards and regs are one thing, how you operationalize them in a real life business environment is another. And that's where we are right now, is trying to figure out all of that. Thank you for some of the folks that have posted questions. We'll get to those in due course along the way. So let me hop to the second element here, which is developing a quality control plan. And this for me is I think one of the most challenging things to really think about. And it's one of the things that's somewhat new for people that maybe have had a scanning environment before, but haven't really had it in as rigorous a context as FADGI 3 levels require. And I think that, the little piece that you read, Scott, from the quality management guide, the words that really stand out to me, and this is at the heart of this, is this notion of consistency and accuracy and scanning and capture processes operating at kind of industrial levels of quality assurance, like any other key business process that you have. And while we've had elements of that in the past with how we approach temporary records, we haven't had the rigor that's associated with permanent records. And we haven't had the rigor, keep in mind why NARA did this in the first place, the rigor that would allow the destruction of the originals in the first place. So this is a huge step forward in terms of the discipline that surrounds scanning and capture processes. So the elements that NARA has in the quality management guide are, first of all, you need to scan targets containing grayscale, color scale, and dimensional scale at the beginning of each workday. You have to replace targets as they fade or accumulate dirt, and there's some issues associated with that I think Scott will talk about. You have to frequently test equipment and systems along the way to make sure they're performing optimally. You have to figure out some sort of image quality analysis software that can verify the performance of your systems. And then you also have to be conscious of the fact that often equipment doesn't work in isolation. It works in combination with different drivers. It works in combination with different workflows, and that you have to check and test the equipment in the context of all those different combinations that you might have involved in a particular business process. So Scott, why don't you dive a little bit into some of the practical things that people ought to be thinking about along the way as they think about these NARA requirements?
Yeah, sounds great, John. I'll take a similar approach, and having read through this quality management guide so many different times, again, well written. We've said that on several different occasions, but I'll take a snippet from what's been shared in the guideline itself. Quality control is the responsibility of the team that tests the product for defects. Again, very different than quality assurance. Testing early and often is a basic quality control strategy. During the digitization process, agencies must perform QC testing and analysis to identify malfunctioning or improperly configured digitization equipment, improper software application settings, incorrect metadata capture, or human error, and take corrective action. So what that's trying to explain to us is that what's different about these guidelines and what's different about the ability for my agency to meet these compliance standards are the techniques that are required around. When we talk about tools, we're not just talking about the hardware devices. We're really talking about the application of the software. We're now talking about the introduction of these targets that are being used to help the devices themselves to comply. They're wearables, right? And so depending upon what the frequency of these tests are that are being performed on the equipment, and depending upon the production level of the devices themselves, the parameters that we're going to use to have a strict quality control process are going to change, right? Not only with the volume of content that's being fed into the device itself, but the way that the software is behaving with the output of the content, as well as the actual introducing of the dice target. So there are a number of different softwares that are out there. I think we mentioned here, there's Open Dice. We work pretty closely with the ISA team with Golden Thread. And have had quite a bit of success with that application and its dice targets and so forth. But there's work to be involved around specifically the quality control process. It's different than what most of us have done for years. And I think it's important that we define what makes it different and then establish rules within our quality control plan for how it is that we would move forward to test each of these devices to ensure that we're not getting different results based on different times of day or different operators or different types of equipment and so forth. So quality control, again, a really important step to what's needed for the agency's ability to comply with these new guidelines.
I think that's it raises so many thoughts for me, Scott, as I listen to you talk about this, and look at those items that are across on the top blue line. There is that so much. This is so much more than looking to see whether a scanner has a FADGI3 badge on it. Certainly understanding whether a scanner is capable of producing FADGI3 images is kind of step one. But then step two is, this is a process standard, not necessarily a hardware standard. And so the second question needs to be, and that's what all these blue things are about here, is in what context is the equipment being used? And it's verifying that the process performs at those levels of quality, I think, is what makes this so complicated, because you can't just, it's not just buy something with a badge on it and then set it and forget it. You've got to basically understand how that process works and how it produces a scanning process that it is auditable and has integrity and meets all the guidelines, with all the different permutations that occur during the course of a business day for that scanner operator. So really interesting to think about that. We're gonna switch gears for just a second here, and I want to just ask you guys 3 questions, and it'll help us really understand a couple things. It'll understand where some of your pain points and challenge points are. It'll also help us understand how we focus future iterations of this series. And if I can find where my poll is, I will tee it up. So let's see, where is my poll? Here we are. And there's 3 questions. It won't take but a second, and you can kind of help us out here. So the question 1, you can see, and you can start chiming in on the poll. It should be up on the screen for you guys right now. Is on a scale of 1 to 5, where are you right now? 1 being just getting started, and 5 being that you have a fully baked strategy and you are just like ready to go. Then where are you right now? And just give us your sense of where you are in terms of this. The second one, and I'm hoping you all are seeing the poll. If not, then please yell. Secondly, is that QAI is thinking of organizing some 90-minute sessions in the DC area. One of the things that we find is that when people think about how they go about this, they'll get contacted by one vendor, and then one vendor, and then one vendor, and then one vendor. And what's particularly useful is to view all these pieces of equipment at one time in a neutral environment, and kick the tires a bit and ask questions and talk about your own business processes and talk about some of the challenges that you have. So if you'd be interested in that, we're thinking about doing that in either January or February. Just let us know if that sounds like something that you might be interested in. And then the third thing is, if you could give us your sense and kind of think about this from the perspective of vote for 3 issues, if you will. So so think about, what are your biggest challenges and concerns with these new requirements? And again, vote for 3 in this case. And what we want to do is basically understand where people are, and that'll help us figure out who might be some good new speakers to have, who might be some different topics that we should tee up along the way. And I'll give this about another minute or so for you to respond, and then I'll share some of the results with you so that we can get a sense of where people are. So let's just give it a minute. And meanwhile, you can ask questions along the way and tee that up. I ought to have one of those those Jeopardy, like da da na 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 dun 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 dun. Okay, I'm going to turn it off in just a second here, and we'll particularly look at the first one and the third one and see where you all are. So you should be, if the miracle of Zoom is working, be seeing the results right now. What you can see here is, and this basically is kind of what I thought would be the case. I'd love for the people that have a fully baked strategy to share at some point during future webinars how you've gone about that, how you've approached it, some of the experiences that you've had, some of the lessons that you've learned. But you can see, that it's not a bell curve at this point. We're still very early in the process, and it's one of those curves that's tilted way to the left side of the axis, in which most people are still getting started and trying to figure out what to do about all this. The other one, if we kind of go through here in terms of which are the biggest concerns along the way, and let me just scroll through and take a look here. And these are pretty interesting, I think, when I think about this, is that you've got, again, understanding the operational requirements. There is a fair amount of confusion about documents we've already scanned. That's dealt with in the regulations, but I think operationally people haven't figured out how to go about that. And then you probably are, this is a pretty sophisticated audience in terms of records management, so not a lot of confusion about temporary and permanent records, but there are a lot of questions about how that matches up against imaging skills, which are different than records management skills. So that's really interesting. Scott, anything you want to chime in on those results?
No, I wish that more folks would have, at this time, given where the deadline is, moved to the category of 5. But what calls and so forth continue to come into our environment are, all the people that are struggling in the 1 to 2 to 3 to probably 4 category. So I guess I'm not surprised by these results, and there's, in and around 60 plus people, I think, providing input to this.
Great. So let's move on. We'll go back to our little charts again. So let's assume that you have built up strategy. You've figured out where you are. You've procured what you need to do this. You've started the process of scanning at industrial scale and at the levels of image quality requirements you need to do. What's in the NARA requirements in terms of inspection? And so in that image quality document, they basically say agencies must perform a visual inspection by inspecting a random sample of a minimum of 10 image files, or 10% of each batch of image files, whichever is larger, and determine these things: that the image tone, brightness, contrast, and color match the specs in the regulation, that the images are free from clipping, which is when you have detail that's in the shadows of an image, that images are free from any artifacts that may compromise the informational content. I will be fully transparent with all of you. I do not know what Newton's rings are. So if somebody knows what Newton's rings are, then put it in the Q&A. It would probably educate me a little bit. It sounds very mysterious, and I kind of like the concept. And then also just that the images have the expected dimensions and orientation, landscape, portrait, all that kind of stuff, that they're not skewed in the wrong way. So this is what you have to inspect for, to make sure that you are consistent with the NARA requirements. And Scott, why don't you talk a little bit about what this means in real life?
Yeah, I'll start off by giving some feedback around the just a quick summary of what's mentioned in the quality management doc. first. So it first states that inspection is the process of measuring, examining, testing, or otherwise comparing the product, which would of course be the deliverable, with the requirements. The inspection process incorporates sampling techniques to identify the percentage of errors that occur. It is not desirable to conduct a visual review of every file that has been digitized. And it goes on to say, and I think most of us that are in these digitization programs and projects, and most large projects, visual inspection of all files is impractical. Therefore, a statistically valid sample of digital files from each batch must be inspected. So that's really what this whole inspection component is talking about, that we've properly implemented a QA plan that's supported by a QC plan in and around the devices and so forth themselves. And then to add on to that, what sort of inspection process is needed to ensure that, I go back to that accuracy and continuity, right? So how do these things build on one another? And what is it that we're going to do to define this inspection requirement? Obviously, you know, I mentioned earlier, and certainly in these larger projects, completely impractical to try and inspect every single page of every single document. So, you know, what does the backup to that look like? And ultimately, what becomes, you know, a sufficient inspection process so that we can ultimately have the agency complying with NARA's guidelines? This gets complicated because some of our permanent records might just not always be clean documents. You know, we could have photos and larger docs and things that are more complicated to pull through a digitization or a scanning process. So, you know, this inspection process we're referring to, I don't think is a set it and forget it thing. I think you've really got to look at the nature of the type of material that you're working on and expect that there's, you know, a pivot or a potential adjustment to the how frequently we're looking at the original versus what it is that we're going to provide in the deliverable. So, John, that's just some normal feedback, I think, around this inspection piece.
So thank you very much. That's really very helpful. Just a couple of notes along the way. Thank you all for posting questions. There's some good questions in there to deal with. If folks have answers to some of the questions along the way, please feel free to post them there. You can, and also if there's particular ones that look exciting to you, give it an upvote along the way. Tommy Lee, thank you very much for the definition of Newton rings, which everybody can see in the Q&A. That it's always nice to have an expert on there, and we've interacted in the past, and you were certainly an expert along the way. So thank you for that. Maury, I saw your hand raised. We haven't turned on the live audio questions, so that'll probably be in the next session. So if you do have a question, please raise it in the Q&A, and we'll see if we can get to it. So, and then one other thing is that somebody helpfully pointed out, which, and this is on me, that I goofed. I put the presentation in the lobby, but I didn't put it in the resources tab. So we'll figure out a way to get it to you. And if you need it in kind of an emergency session, then send me an email at jmancini77, JMANCINI77 @gmail, and I'll make sure I get it to you right away. So I think that's all the administrative things. And let's turn to validating. And this gets into, again, making sure that, okay, I have looked and set up my strategy. I have scanned some images. I've inspected those images. And now I have to validate the process. And how do I go about that? And so these are some of the elements that NARA requires that folks validate along the way. And it's a pretty comprehensive list, as you might expect. Verifying that everything's been accounted for, verifying that all the informational content has been captured, verifying that all the digitized records are in the same order as the original source records, examining records that make sure that you've included any containers that they might have existed, or any post-it notes or anything else that might have been associated with the records. Verifying that they are consistent and contain all of the different metadata that's required. And then also, if you have things that you can't digitize that are related to a digitized record, making sure that those things connect together. And then confirming that any missing pages or images are noted in documentation that accompanies the process. So that's a lot. And Scott, why don't you chat a little bit about some of the complexities of that?
Yeah, I think for starters, one thing we find in the validation requirement is that it really begins pre the digitization effort itself. So, you know, for agencies and organizations that are leading with a really strong and controlled records management effort for inventory and for manifest, and ultimately for the how it is that they validate, you know, where documents are and how they're organized and so forth. All that is in place, obviously, in the front end of the prior to the digitization of all of this material. So I think in the way that we've positioned this conversation and the way that document is presented through NARA, it's sort of to suggest that validation is to occur post the digitization process. But I want to point out that there's a relationship between how organized I am going into it to the success of my validation requirement, you know, post the actual digitization effort. So I've been reading out of this guideline the entire time, and I want to finish doing that because, as I said before, they've done a great job, and they've helped to really distinguish each of these four categories that John and I have spent the last 40 minutes talking about. One of the things that NARA says in the guideline is that validation is a higher level review of an agency's digital records and the process that were used to create them. Validation occurs when digitization is complete and must be conducted by staff that were not involved in the quality control inspections conducted during the digitization process. And I think there's a lot of validity to that. One thing that I think is pointed out in that statement that I just mentioned is these are not likely to be successful programs if my QA person is the same person that's doing my QC process, that's also doing my inspections, who's also performing validation. You know, the way that this becomes successful is each of these chronological steps is an inspection of themselves. And if it's the same operator who's continuously doing all these different steps, it makes it very difficult for anybody to review their own work, right? And we've all come across that scenario in the past. But if there is a step or a stage of our process that's clearly an outlier to all the things that John and I have been talking about as an independent role in the overall digitization process, it would be this validation step. So John's got a lot of different boxes in this slide describing, you know, various things that go on within the validation requirement. But the few things that I just shared with you, I think from our own experience are probably the most critical and the most important to defining the how it is that validation becomes critical to the overall process for the creation of the deliverable. It also, I want to make one other mention, you know, it also starts to help the agency decide, you know, what it is that we're going to do with the materials themselves, right? And so if there ever was a disposition schedule, is that defined in the validation requirement, or was it previously defined early on in the records management efforts that had gone into all this prior? These are also steps that can be validated at the end of these programs, you know, prior to the agency making a determination as to what it is they're intended or wanting to do with the physical records post the digitization program. So hopefully we've given you what we really feel are the most important things to come from this recent guidance. The goal of this webinar was for us to take our practical and operational experience along with what's been provided by NARA and summarize it to the extent that it's a little more a little easier to understand, I guess, and so many different moving parts and things that are pretty confusing to wrap yourself around on how it is we'll take these next steps going into these new guidelines and these new efforts.
So thank you, Scott. I just wanted to highlight too, Michael Horsley, who I noticed is on the call, will be our next speaker on December 13th to kind of give us a little behind the scenes look of how we got from there to here and what some of those implications are. And I'll also say, Michael, I can't see you directly and speak to you directly, but I can speak to you directly, not the other way. I've told you many times along the way that we're all learning on this as we go through this. If there's anything that we've said during the course of the conversation that you had that SMH, shaking my head and thought like, I don't know if that's right, then please let me know, and we'll kind of correct the record, if you will. So I appreciate all the constructive comments that you've had along the way. So let's talk a little bit about some of the questions that we have here. And some of these, if we can't get to them all, we'll get to them either offline or on the next session on December 13th. I misspoke earlier and I said the 15th. It's on the 13th. So let's talk a little bit. Let me just kind of browse through these for a sec. Hold on. Scott, why don't you talk a little bit about the question of whether this is possible to do this without the DICE software? And Tiffany Minchell has answered this question. The question had to do whether it's possible to do this without the DICE software, that they're a small agency. My immediate reaction was that I don't think so. Tiffany responded that it's required regardless of volume. And Tiffany, you might want to, maybe you could post your email in this question to let James contact you in terms of answering those questions. But I think we've covered that. Is there anything that you would disagree with on that, Scott?
No, Tiffany is a colleague of mine, so I don't want to compromise her response, but she has also spent considerable time in our Digital Innovation Center and has taken many different products through the process of determining how to ultimately produce, FADGI compliance. So the DICE target is critical to the overall process. It's what establishes the scanner to become compatible with its ability to provide this type of outcome. We covered a little bit of that too in John, where we talked about the quality control plan and the use of the actual physical DICE target and how it is that the software and so forth is relating to the compatibility of all that. This seems to be something that comes up a lot in terms of a question that we answer. It's different for different devices, and as more of this requirement comes online, we're starting to see more private sector organizations get into the space. Not all of them are coming at it with the same approach. So without trying to get too much further into the response to that question, I would say let's take that one offline and let one of our SMEs, Tiffany being one, to answer that specific question, John.
Yeah, and Mike Horsley had an interesting comment on that, which is that particularly for small scale folks, this might be an ideal scenario where you choose to outsource it to somebody, so that if you don't have that competency in-house, you could outsource it to a vendor to ask them to be responsible for that. And that ties to a question up here at the very top. And Scott, I think you can see this has to do with outsourcing, and it's a long question, but let me see if I can digest it here. talk about maintaining all the different checks in the subpart E requirements and all that. But maybe this is a chance to talk a little bit about the whole question of outsourcing and whether that makes sense for agencies or under what circumstances it might make sense for agencies.
Yeah, that comment around, some of the smaller agencies identifying a budget, to acquire, these techniques and this equipment and so forth. I mean, obviously, one of the options for them is to consider, the role of outsourcing. There's really three things that Quality Associates does for all of the customers that we're supporting today. One is to have an exclusive relationship to the extent that materials are being outsourced to our digital innovation centers. The second one is where we're providing these type of solutions back to the customer or federal agency location. So we're outfitting them with all of our, production and mid-production type devices, software, hardware training, in some cases, even the staffing that's needed to perform this task. And then the last approach, which actually has made sense for a lot of the agencies that we work with today, if there are large back files of permanent records and the agency isn't equipped to do that, particularly with the deadline looming, that work has come to us as an outsourced effort. And then we are taking more of a less production approach to try and maintain, their permanent records in-house. So we refer to that as a hybrid approach. But those three scenarios are what we're traditionally doing for most of the agencies that we're supporting today.
Scott, there's a time for a few more questions. There's a question here, and I'll venture my answer in advance, which I think the answer is it depends, which is about cost of scanners that are FADGI 3 capable. Any rule of thumb there?
Hard to tell. I mean, I think the rule of thumb right now is that there's somewhere about an in or around about 10 to 15% increase to the overall cost. Obviously, there's softwares that are freeware in the market today. There's other softwares that come at an expense. So I think the general rule of thumb, John, is that there are things that are required to perform these guidelines and to meet and comply with these scenarios that are coming at a cost that are not traditional to a normal digitization requirement, whether that was the increase in the hardware cost or, having to newly introduce some of these softwares to do a number of the things that we've been talking about. That would probably be the best general rule that we could share on this call.
So there's a couple questions related to FADGI compliant scanning, whether there's a checklist, whether there's a list of those companies and hardware vendors, and somebody helpfully pointed out to check out fedscale.com. There is also a question here, and maybe we'll just use this as the last one before we adjourn. Is there training to help agencies test scanners that are in place? And is that a role that NARA will have? And so I won't answer for NARA, but I don't know that there's training, although companies like QAI could probably help with that question.
Yeah, for sure. We will know of the models that are in your environments. We will know whether or not they're capable of producing this output. We'll also make recommendations. There may be trade-in programs for some of these devices, but that's what our advisors do. And I think John mentioned earlier, we're seeing questions come from so many different perspectives. And the one thing that we're trying to do as an organization is to be that one organization that can talk to all the different things that have been mentioned through the course of this webinar. Hardware, software, testing, training. We want to be that one-stop shop for the agencies obviously that we're supporting. So we've got a lot of people that are in place that have spent considerable time looking at all these testing processes and so forth. We've got great cooperation from the private sector community that's developing either the software or making the actual devices. They're in our centers all the time in hopes that QAI, learns more and potentially endorses their device. So it's our consulting group. You put up there both John and Doug. John for points of contact. Both of these guys are great at what they do and spending every day advising various agencies on responses to a number of the questions that we're seeing coming in.
And just one last thing before we adjourn is that Mike Horsley helpfully noted that NARA is not going to do training in the previous question, but will provide guidance in how to go about that. And Victoria very helpfully offered to share, she's with DOJ, to share their draft project plan and validation report to use in the context of each scanning project, and has offered to share that with folks. And if you go into the Q&A, you'll see her email there, so make sure you take a look at that. I'll leave that up for just a couple minutes as we close, just so if you want to copy paste that so that you can contact her later on. That sounds extremely helpful. So I'll leave you with one last thought of mine, and then Scott, leave you with one last thought, which is that my last thought is that this is doable. It's not simple. It's different, and it requires to take a step back and look at what you're doing and how you're doing it, and to keep in mind that the reason that we're doing that NARA is doing this in the first place is that they are essentially working to preserve the historical archive of the country, and that becomes really much more complicated than it used to be when everything was paper. So, Scott, one last thought you want before we close?
Yeah, I guess, John, along the same lines of what you're mentioning, the majority of what is unknown and seems to be unclear is that comment around operationalizing all of this. There seems to be better clarity for certain components than others, but how do you get answers from the beginning of when this all starts to the final stages of the validation and ultimately the ability for your agency to comply? It's tricky, and I will tell you, we've made so many adjustments ourselves trying to figure this out. And so as new products come to market and as new organizations continue to get involved in all of this, I think it's going to be a continuous learning curve. But with that in mind, I think there are dependable, there are reliable, there are solid suggestions and advice that are capable of being provided for a federal agency to effectively and efficiently comply with these guidelines. It's just a question of getting the right advice, putting things in place that make sense, and bringing on a team, if needed, of outsourced experts to guide that process.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott. Thanks, everybody, for being there. We'll see you on December 13th with Mike Horsley, which will, I wanted to title this also maybe like everything you wanted to know about how we got from there to here, but we're afraid to ask. But that reference probably dates me incredibly in terms of the original book that it referred to. So thank you all for being here. We'll see you. Have a happy Thanksgiving, and thanks again for everybody.
All right. Thank you.